Hi, welcome to session one of the first topic of the semester titled The Idea of Progress in the Making of Modern America. We're looking at it the late 19th century from 1865 to 1900. So, this is the very first topic. We're opening up the semester again with this topic that I'm about to introduce in just a few moments. But just keep in mind that this is the very first topic of the semester. There will be 9 topics lectured throughout the semester. And this is the first session. This is session one. Now, let us go then to our slide so we can begin our lecture now. This is session one of the first topic of the semester, the idea of progress in the formation of modern America from 1865 to 1900. Now, what we're going to be doing again in this topic is looking at the late 19th century in terms of how the United States during this time, American society, for the most part, was heavily influenced again by an idea that people consider to be real, to be meaningful, that this was the central idea again for human existence, that could explain not only what humans were doing here on Earth, but really explaining life in general, explaining the life of the universe, and what was the purpose of being alive. And again, this is the idea that people really applied it to almost every area of life, every area of human activity, whether they looked at, for example, politics in that way, or economics, or science, technology. In almost every possible area, they were influenced again by this idea to see that this is the meaning again of everything, and that is the idea of progress. Americans became convinced that this was the central purpose again of human existence. This was almost like, in fact, a law of nature, a natural law, in other words, that everything was intended to progress. And it has been progressing, by the way, since the beginning of time. Americans were convinced of that. A great many of them, not all, of course, but a great many. And that this was, again, something that humans were striving for in the human kingdom. Again, that humans were trying to create this ideal existence, this ideal society in which human happiness will be attained and experienced by most members of the human race, and so on. And again, that this was something that was inevitable, something that was awaiting for humans in the future. Yeah, that this is progress again in the making, that everything has been progressing, improving, getting better and better and better as time progresses, that everything changes. But Americans, again, as many other peoples around the world, particularly in Europe, were convinced that everything was moving towards a higher order, in other words, a higher plane of existence, the ideal place to be, in other words, here on Earth, in which humans were going to be happy, they were going to do away with many of the pains and sufferings that afflicted human beings in the past, and in that, again, this was going to be like a paradise, in other words, a paradise on Earth. So again, it had a lot of implications, this idea of progress, because Americans began to see everything in that fashion. Once again, whether they looked at science or technology or the realm of economics, they believe that everything was progressing, that our science is meant to progress, that our technologies are meant to progress and get better, and our economy as well. We're here to progress economically and so on. So this is very important because this is going to pretty much establish the foundation for the future of the course. I have decided to explain first the idea of progress in the very first topic of the semester, because everything will be built upon this very first floor, so to speak. Every other theme or topic that we're going to cover in the future will deal either directly or indirectly again with this idea. Americans held firmly held this belief across many decades, all the way to even today. Again, Americans are still heavily influenced by progress, to the point that this is what many Americans believe life is meant to be. Again, to progress in terms of knowledge, to progress in terms of education, in terms of higher standards of living, better salaries, better wages, to have better communities, a better society, a better world, etc. Again, this is something that is instilled in our psyche, in our mind, again, from our culture, from our American culture, that is to say. That is not, once again, unique to the United States. This idea is also shared by other societies around the world. It's becoming also very popular around the world, in many societies, particularly in places like Europe and Latin America, and is slowly but surely entering other societies in other civilizations and continents around the world. Slowly but surely, progress is moving steadily in places like the Middle East and Africa, for example, as well, at a much slower pace, if you will, but is entering there as well. All right, so once again, this is going to pretty much serve as the foundation, the root, again, for the remaining of the course, because the United States is initiating a new era around this time. We begin in 1302 again with the end of Civil War and Reconstruction, thereabouts again. And so I explained in the class introduction that this is a time when the United States initiated a whole new era. Okay, ended one era, the era of farming and agriculture, as to be the primary economic activity of the past, and of course the practice of slavery was abolished, and we're moving towards a whole new era after the Civil War and Reconstruction, the era of industry and modernity. A high-tech industrialized world is on the rise. So it's a whole new way of life, a whole new social setting, a whole new reality in every possible way is emerging in the late 19th century. And part of this, again, this new civilization, this new reality arising from the ashes of the Civil War and the process of Reconstruction, was the idea that all of the changes taking place in the U.S., the rapid spread of factories and industries, the rise of the middle class, for example, new technologies that were innovated during this time, and so on, that all of that was part of progress, that we were moving towards a higher order, a higher plane of existence, that is to say, that we're creating the ideal existence that was going to take time. It was not going to be created just all of a sudden, but that was the beginning of a whole new world, in other words. Okay, so Americans interpret this to be something that was bringing progress, improvement, betterment. Again, that once again, it's not that everybody was experiencing the ideal existence. It's not like the problems were solved or everybody suddenly were very prosperous and there was no poverty. Nothing of that sort. But this idea of progress becomes like a religious idea, in the U.S., in that people began to really think that progress was inevitable, that over time, in due course, we were moving there, that every human being is going to have the opportunity to move forward to a better place. Okay, and so this is what we're going to be talking about again in this topic, and the way we're going to understand the idea of progress. Again, the table of contents clearly shows here. Those are the main parts, part 1, part 2, and part 3. What we're going to be covering, in other words, how we're going to break it down. In other words, the idea of progress is by looking at different areas where Americans believed that progress was taking place, and that the more progress we attain in those areas, the quicker we're going to arrive to this higher plane of existence. In other words, this new civilization that awaited us again, this futuristic world that people were dreaming about again. So those three areas, those three parts that we're going to analyze here is science and technology. First and foremost, science and technology. Okay, the scientific and technological revolution of the 19th century, something that actually, goes back even further back, but it is really in the 19th century where we're going to see a very radical revolution in science and technology, where the science of today, what we call modern science, was firmly established in places like the US and Europe. Okay, how scientists were supposed to understand the natural world, trying to understand the forces, the elements, and so on, and harness those forces, harness those elements in order to create new tools, technologies, that is to say, technologies. We're going to see the advent of new technologies in the US and Europe that gave birth to what today we simply call modern technology. Many of the tools that we enjoy today were born during this time. And those technologies, as we'll see, were meant to be used to create this ideal civilization, this perfect human existence that people were dreaming about, where those technologies were supposed to serve us, serve humans, in other words, to create more comforts for us, to do things faster and easier for us again. So we're going to talk about, what kind of science was born, modern science, and also the kind of the technologies, the new technologies that were born in the 19th century, particularly the late 19th century. Okay, that were part of this idea of progress. People were convinced, because there was a new science and technology, that we were achieving progress, that never in the past were humans in possessions of such as they said. Again, this is not me talking. This is just, again, the humans of the 19th century believing that, that for the first time, that there was now a science that people possess that will enable us, that will enable them to understand much better the world around them, and perhaps even control the forces of nature. That was the belief. Again, this is not me talking once again. This is, the people of the past. And of course, the new technologies, when people began to witness all those new technologies that we're going to discuss here, they were also mesmerized again about all of those new tools that appear to be almost like works of magic, miracles in many cases, the miracles of science, and they were called. Something that, we today tend to say sometimes when we come across a technology that is so incomprehensible for us. Okay, say this is miraculous, for example. Okay, so we're going to talk about that in part one. Part two is going to look at an economic aspect of progress in terms of how people during the 19th century believed that it was possible for human beings to achieve progress, economic in this case, economic progress, if we only participate, in a system, an economic system that during that time and even today was known as capitalism. There was, again, a new economic system that was becoming also very firmly established in the United States in the 19th century, known as capitalism. And because capitalism was bringing significant changes to the way people live and did work, particularly the ability to accumulate wealth, for example, to make money and so on, people began to see that, that capitalism, the rise of capitalism was also a sign of progress. Once again, this is the perception of the peoples living during that time, that they said, oh, it is possible to live better. It is possible to raise ourselves to a higher standard of living, if we participate in capitalist enterprise, for example, if we work hard and so on, save money or invest it in some business and so on, that there's a possibility for improvement, economic betterment, in other words. Okay, so this is something we're gonna look at, in part two. In part three, we're going to look at a scientific theory that is going to become widely popular in the United States. It will be embraced by many, but also rejected by other people, of course. It was not embraced by everybody, but this scientific theory, that was actually proposed by a British biologist by the name of Charles Darwin, had a tremendous influence, again, in the way people are going to actually look at progress, because this scientific theory proposed that since the beginning of time, the whole world, indeed the whole universe, has been improving. Okay, this is a scientific idea that is called evolution. That the whole universe is evolving. So evolution means that life in general, life in the universe in general, is moving from a simple creation to a more complex and a more intelligent creation. Okay, so again, this is an idea that was proposed by a British biologist, Charles Darwin, in the 1850s. The theory of evolution is going to revolutionize the world as a whole, not only in Europe but all over the world, turn it upside down in many cases. But the impact that this theory is going to have in the United States is that many Americans began to actually use the theory of evolution to reaffirm their beliefs about scientific progress or technological progress or even economic progress. So they said, oh, so if nature is evolving and everything is improving, that this is happening in the world of nature, so it is true then, they said, that we're supposed to improve ourselves the way we think that, that we're supposed to live better, have a better economic well-being, a higher social status, for example, that we should accumulate wealth, for example, make more money because, that's evolution, okay? Or we should improve our science and build more tools, more technologies, because that's evolution, they said. So almost in everything, again, when Americans looked around, they pretty much, looked at progress everywhere, but this theory of evolution, which came from science, kind of, influenced the way Americans were already looking at progress, and said, okay, so if science is saying that everything is evolving and, it's evolving towards a higher order, that the whole universe is actually moving towards a higher order, then they said, we're right in thinking that this is what humans should be doing anyways. We should be creating this ideal society in which people should strive to live better, more comfortable, and higher standards of living and all that. Okay, making more money, earning more wages, etc. All of that. Okay, because they said it's evolution. Okay, so this is the table of contents. This is something that we're going to actually break down step by step. So I'm going to provide more in-depth, of course, analysis again as we go. But this is extremely important because, look, you're going to understand after we cover this topic in 3 separate sessions, you're going to understand pretty much, how this new modern industrial America was founded upon. What were the most important ideas that actually founded this new civilization that even we live in today? Again, this called modernity, this high-tech industrial civilization again. you're going to understand, the most important beliefs and ideas that actually brought it to existence. So it is going to help you not only understand the rest of the course, but really understand ourselves even today. Why we place so much emphasis like on science or technology for solving problems, for example, or why is it that we have so much faith, for example, in economic progress? Why is it that people want to make more money, for example? Okay, and of course, evolution. We see everything evolving, and this is pretty much the lens from which we see everything. That human societies, as well as organisms themselves, and even things like germs and pathogens and viruses are also evolving and mutating and adapting. Of course, we see everything in that fashion, by the way. Okay, so again, this is going to be very helpful for understanding the world today, the world that we inhabit. So again, this is a type of history that look at ideas. Again, the history of ideas, and this is important because, as I mentioned in the class introduction, it's not just enough to study the past in terms of the politics and economics, what political parties are doing, or congressmen, or judges, or presidents, or how the economy is doing at any given period of time. It's also important to understand how people think. Okay, how people actually think, how people frame the world that they live in, how they understand it. Because if we don't do that, then we're not really understanding, the past. Because when we study history, history is made by people. Okay, by human beings, and if we don't understand people as fully as possible, then we're not really fully understanding the past. Then that's what I'm trying to say here. Okay, so this is going to be, again, a kind of a history of ideas, so to speak. Okay, the main idea we're going to be looking at, of course, is the idea of progress. Okay, so first, before we look into science and technology, I would like to offer just a quick introduction, to the idea of progress in terms of just looking at, for example, definitions. Why is it that this word or term was coined? Where was it coined? And so on, when this happened and so on, just to kind of pinpoint, the time frame from which this idea emerged in history, the context, the background, in other words. And then we can go into science, technology, and everything else that I just explained. All right, so at any rate, okay, so looking at the introduction and definitions of progress. So this idea was actually coined in the 1700s. It started, again, in the 1700s, particularly in Europe. It is in Europe when, for the first time, this idea was introduced in the writings, in the conversations of European scientists, European philosophers, that later on, through those writings, the writings of European scientists and philosophers, this idea was introduced to the United States as well. Okay, so why is it that Europeans were coining and for the first time, pretty much, even writing about progress, was because of really dramatic and radical changes that were taking place in Europe, particularly in Europe, but also those changes are also going to take place in the United States. Okay, so they first occurred in Europe, but back to back, those changes began to also arise in the United States. So Europe and the United States were really the home, if you will, of this idea called progress, starting in the 1700s. And it is really in the 1800s that it becomes such a popular notion, very popular concept, that not only philosophers and scientists were writing about that, but even common people, common folk, again, began to actually ponder on that and believe about that. Okay, so what were some of those radical, dramatic changes that I was talking about? Well, those radical dramatic changes taking place in Europe that influenced those European philosophers and scientists were very new and transformative changes taking place. In other words, they were something new that has never been experienced in the past that really convinced people that what was really going on in their societies, those changes taking place, because they were so new and so transformative, it was transforming the way people live, the way people thought about the world, the way people did work, for example, that because they were so new, again, and so transformative, that what they believed to be is that those changes were a sign that human societies were now moving towards something higher and better, a new and better world, that is to say, that the changes taking place around them were really signs that a new civilization, a whole new world, okay, that was better than the one they lived in and the ones that they knew about the past, that because it was something better, again, arising, that therefore they said, okay, so this is a sign that everything has been improving and progressing, okay, improving and progress. This is the first time it happens, they said, that we can actually notice how fast one world comes to an end and a new one emerges in a way that now humans can see that this has been going all along, that human beings have been progressing all the time. Okay, so they said, oh, so progress is real. We're not just, human beings here in this earth trying to survive and living random experiences and just getting by with nothing really changing, but rather that for thousands of years, human beings have actually improved, the way they live, their knowledge, and everything else, their tools. So they have arrived now to a point in which they were becoming really the highest expression of intelligence, they said. Okay? For example, they will often say, the European philosophers, look, once upon a time in the distant past, our ancestors lived in caves, okay, and in the jungle, and we don't live there anymore. Okay, so we got out of the cave, we got out of the jungle, and perhaps we were eating raw meat. Our distant human ancestors were, they call that primitive, by the way, that that they didn't know any better. They were just like animals, in other words. But they got out of that condition of this animal-like kind of state, and they developed their physical and mental capacities to the point that they said, look, we have arrived now to this point. So something got us here, and it took a lot of stages, a lot of steps to get here, but that means progress. We have progressed a lot, that human beings are now, highly intelligent creatures that are now able to shape their world, their society, create a whole new civilization. That's exactly one of the first changes that those European scientists and philosophers and the Europeans as a whole were witnessing, is that in the 1700s, what really, again, Europeans witnessing is that they were witnessing the birth, and this is really just the birth. This is not to say that in the 1700s suddenly, this very highly advanced civilization was already present, but they were witnessing the birth of a high-tech industrial civilization. A high-tech industrial civilization. Okay, something that actually started in England in the 1700s. We call that the Industrial Revolution, by the way. But this Industrial Revolution that emerged in England in the 1700s, that later on spread into other places of Europe, like France and Holland, Germany, and it also, of course, is going to also spread in North America, in the United States, in the 1800s as well. that it was really a new and transformative change that has, at least, I mean, from our standpoint, has never really happened to this level again, such as transformative, phenomenon such as this, because one of the central features of this high-tech industrial civilization that was mind-boggling, it boggled the mind of millions again of people around the world, particularly in Europe, is that this is a civilization based on the invention and the use of machines. It really brought about what is called the machine age. Okay, the machine age, the age of the machines. That's what the Industrial Revolution was all about, by the way. Okay, so it was a revolution in technology. Machines were invented that were to replace human labor and animal muscle, animal power for the production of consumer products or goods of all kinds, and the transportation of those goods as well. So instead of people doing that by hand, as it was as traditional for thousands of years, people have to actually craft and manufacture everything manually, that now there's going to be a machine that is going to do it much faster, much easier, and more efficiently than by people. Okay, and the transportation of products and so on. Again, gonna do it by machines too, machinery like railroads and steamboats and so on. So the machine age. So suddenly, again, people began to just wonder how marvelous that was. That look, imagine, the machines of today. They said, back in the 1700s, they said, look, can you imagine the machines of the future? How advanced those machines are going to be, how easy our life is going to be in the future. So they began to imagine the future to be a better one, because if we just came up with this now, we're just supposed to progress and improve those technologies and make them better. And the future that awaits us, down the line, maybe 100, 200, 300 years from now, is gonna be a whole new world, a high-tech, futuristic civilization, they said. Okay, so the fact that they witness machines now, producing everything, that humans required, was mind-boggling. I repeat, okay, because that was almost like magical, okay, for the peoples of those times, and so because of this new innovation, the machinery, the Europeans began to ponder upon progress. Like, look, progress is real. Imagine we have arrived to a point where humans have gathered significant knowledge. We have accumulated significant knowledge to enable us to now invent machines that are going to work for us. Okay, and create a new society, a new future. We have abundance of products. Now machines are going to be doing the work for us, working for us. And it has never happened, they said. Okay, never in human history. So they said this is a sign of progress. Okay, so it has a historical background. The idea of progress did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged precisely when significant radical change was taking place, in places like Europe and North America, in terms of new machinery, high tech, of course, innovation, high technology, that is to say, advanced technologies and so on. Okay, so that influenced, again, Europeans to start pondering that progress was actually, of course, real. Okay, now, of course, that's not the only new and transformative change that influenced Europeans and Americans to ponder upon progress. The other change that was also new and transformative was the rise of a new economic system that ended the system of the past, the economic system of the past that have governed not only Europeans, but really, literally, human societies worldwide. That human societies around the world have lived in for thousands of years, by the way. Not just for hundreds of years, but really for thousands of years since the ancient world. Um, it's called feudalism, by the way. Feudalism. We're gonna get there, once we talk about, capitalism. You're gonna see, of course, the word feudalism. I'm gonna explain what that is. But um, in the 1700s, we're gonna see a new economic system that introduced new changes in society that allow people to accumulate wealth. Okay, something that was very difficult under the old economic order called feudalism. Wealth accumulation was the privilege, if you will, of kings and landlords, but not of the general population. The general population couldn't really, progress very much economically, couldn't accumulate wealth because it was difficult because the land, for example, was owned by the king, by the landowners, and so on. And it was, again, because there was no private ownership of resources, private ownership of the land, it was extremely difficult, for people to make money, to create enterprises and businesses, etc. Again, it was just difficult under the old feudal order. Let me just, write it here. The old feudal order, just for your information. Again, this is what we're talking about: feudalism or feudal. Uh, so again, wealth accumulation was very difficult under feudalism. And this is something that human societies have lived on for many, many centuries in the past, once again. So in the 1700s, we're going to see the arrival of a new economic system that began replacing feudalism in places like England, and capitalism is going to spread into other places of Europe and North America, the United States, for example. It's going to spread into the places I just mentioned in Europe, like France, Holland, Germany, Italy, of course, and other places as well. From the 1700s to the 1800s, and in the 1900s, of course, capitalism is going to spread into many areas of the globe. But the rise of capitalism was another transformative change that convinced people that progress was real, because the introduction of capitalism by the English, those were the English merchants, by the way. It was not that easy to institute capitalism because the landowners and the king, of course, opposed it. It was actually a war. There was actually a war waged between the merchants and the landlords and the English king that allowed for the introduction of capitalism, when finally the English monarchies were defeated, of course, by the late 1600s. By the 1700s, we're going to see now the rapid spread of capitalism in England, which really allowed for people to accumulate wealth, to build wealth, to make money. And how capitalism accomplished that is because it introduced the idea of private property. The ownership of property by individual, that you can buy property. Not just the king or the landowners are entitled to that, but that property can be bought and sold by virtually anybody. That is to say, if you have, of course, money to do that, you can buy property. You can buy a piece of land. You can buy resources. You can have entitlement. You can have a property title of that, and so on. So private property. Okay, and why is that important to allow people to own property? Is because under capitalism, the idea is that you have to allow people to make money. So if you allow them to own property, then they can use that property to create a business. This is what you call free enterprise. Free enterprise is the ability for individuals to open up a business, any business. Okay, and so in order to have that ability, you need to allow people to actually purchase land or resources. In other words, to own property. If you own property, you can have, the opportunity to open up a business, a free enterprise. Okay, and what that did over time, the introduction of private property and free enterprise, this is something that capitalism introduced, is that this allowed for the creation of a middle class, merchants, shopkeepers, people that were, owning a small shop or a small business, a manufacturing plant, and so on. They were, they owned property, they owned enterprises, and they were accumulating wealth. And with that, we're going to see the rise of a whole new class that was virtually non-existent in the old feudal order, the middle class. So that really, again, convinced certain societies, the capitalist societies, that progress was possible, and that this was actually the goal of human existence. Again, people are supposed to progress economically. And the only way we can do that is if we live in a capitalist system, that is to say. Okay, so capitalism became deeply associated with economic progress at that time, just because of the changes that it was bringing about. Again, during that time. Okay, and another, of course, new and transformative change taking place in the 1800s was the discovery of a prehistoric past. There's a lot of engineers, miners that were coming across the bones, the fossils of dinosaurs, and what appeared to be human-like creatures. We call humanoids. So human beings that had different bone structures or composition. Okay, and so this was something unknown to the people of the world. What are those animals, for example? Okay, how long ago they lived, what happened to them? So all of those questions convince people that that progress was also real, because what they believed is that those creatures that were buried there, those dinosaurs or human-like creatures and all of that, were life forms that inhabited the earth in the distant past, that died off or could not really evolve. They could not keep up with the changes, so therefore nature chose them to face off in order for the strong organisms that were present in the earth to continue this process of evolution. So this is another thing, again, that many scholars, scientists, philosophers, and so on during this time used to actually propose that progress was real, because they said, look at nature. Now, there has been species that have become extinct, whereas we still continue here. So therefore, they said, again, it's something that they said, this does not reflect my own ideas or beliefs, that they said, well, maybe it is because those were not fit to survive. So nature selected them to die, in other words, and allowed the strongest and the fittest, in other words, to continue this process of life on earth. Because maybe that's what nature is all about, is progressing. So it's making sure that the species that are alive on earth are the ones that are supposed to be the fittest, in other words. Okay, so those are, again, events in taking place in Europe and North America that convinced a lot of people that progress was actually real. The high-tech industrial civilization, this machine age, the rise of capitalism, with all the changes that capitalism brought, of course, and also, of course, the discovery of this prehistoric past. Again, the minds of the people living in the western side of the globe, whether we're talking about Europe or North America, began to ponder that life as a whole, of course, was changing, and it was changing, for the better, moving to a higher plane, that is to say. So these changes brought new beliefs about progress. Okay, The changes I just mentioned brought certain beliefs about progress that are going to altogether, again, become part of this creed, this new religion, again, that is so ingrained in us, in our culture, this religion about progress, again, that we hold, progress to be so real, and this is the meaning of life in general. And that is that those changes, again, brought about, again, the belief that human beings can overcome problems and even dominate nature through scientific knowledge. Okay, so this is very important, that because there was now a high-tech civilization with the invention of machines and the machine age, again, the people living during this time were convinced that, look, what really was used to produce this new high-tech civilization was knowledge. Okay, we have accumulated significant knowledge to have created those miracles of science and technology called machines. So what they said is that knowledge is the answer, they said. If we continue progressing in science, in other words, if we continue accumulating more and more knowledge, we can overcome all of the problems that have afflicted human beings since the beginning of time. So instead of being victims of nature, the more knowledge that we accumulate, then we can stop being victims and overcome many of the problems like droughts and famine and epidemics and you name it. We can actually even dominate nature through scientific knowledge. Okay? So this is very important, and it's something that I'm going to actually explain once we get into science, the scientific and technological revolution. So, once again, this is something that is even ingrained, again, in our psyche, if we're educated in this part of the world, in that, science is used for everything, for solving problems. We try to solve problems that arise in the world of nature, in the world of humans, and so on, by the application of scientific research, that is to say. So there's a certain faith, in other words, in scientific progress, because we think that the more progress we attain in science, that, well, the more that we're going to overcome, problems and even dominate nature. The other belief was the belief that economic security, prosperity, and well-being were the source of human happiness. There's another thing, again, that the people that were experiencing, economic prosperity with the arrival of capitalism, that were accumulating wealth, for example, okay, through free enterprise and so on, they were becoming part of the middle class and so on. They believe that this is the meaning of human existence, is, look, we have to progress economically, because the more progress we attain, the happier we're going to be. Okay? So the more money we have, the higher our social status is, our income, if it's, higher, and so on and so forth. That this is how we attain happiness. In other words, through economic security, prosperity, and well-being, that is to say. So, of course, there's also a faith in our culture to try to progress as much as possible economically, because we think that this is going to take us to this plane of happiness, in other words. Okay, so the more we progress economically, the happier we're going to be. This is what we believe. And also that all living organisms, again, this is another belief, that all living organisms have grown stronger and fitter over time through the law of evolution. Something we're going to see, of course, once we get to the theory of evolution. But this is another belief. We tend to think that everything all around us that is alive, from a plant, a cell, an animal, a human being, a bacteria, doesn't matter, okay? That everything is evolving. And that everything has evolved over time, and in terms of organisms becoming stronger and fitter, in other words, that we're the end point, that everything that you see in the world of nature that is alive is the survival of the fittest, in other words. There's a belief in that as well, okay? So again, this is just a very brief, not so brief, but it's really a synthesis of the idea of progress in terms of where this idea flourished, what were the circumstances that allow for people to think about it, okay, and what were some of the beliefs that people pretty much formulated around, again, the idea of progress. So again, this is just an introduction, so you get a good sense, once again, of um, so you get a good sense, once again, sorry for that, looking at the time, still have some time here. So, so you can get a good sense about uh, where this idea flourished, and be able to understand now the main components that we're going to talk about, whether it's science and technology, the rise of capitalism, and the theory of evolution. You have now a solid base again of understanding, saying, okay, so this is something that happened back in the 1700s with the changes taking place, the high-tech civilization, the rise of capitalism, the theory of evolution. People began to ponder on that. Now let's talk about uh, specifically, again, now the areas that Americans are going to think that are essential to improve ourselves, to attain progress, because this is going to take us to this ideal plane of existence. Okay, progress itself, again, is an idea that pretty much tells us that we are moving slowly but surely towards a higher plane. Okay, that's what progress is. When you're progressing, just if you think about the word progress again, you automatically think that you're improving. Whether it's, for example, you're progressing in your class, well, you're learning more, you're understanding more of the material. You're developing your critical thinking skills, for example. Uh, you might be learning how to write better. Okay, there's improvement there. You are earning better grades, across the semester in your exams. So there's some, uh, very evident, of course, indication that you are indeed, showing signs of progress. So again, progress always indicates that we're moving towards something higher and better in whatever area we're applying it. So it's improvement, in other words. Okay, so in this fashion, we're going to see three areas where Americans are going to be so convinced that this is, again, essential to attain progress, and that is number one, science and technology; second, economics, and again, capitalism; and number three, evolution. So let us then move to look at part one, the scientific and technological revolution. This is going to be very, very fascinating because we're going to see the rise of this new science, how this new science came into being, and of course the scientific and the technological revolution that came along with it. With the rise of a new science came new tools, and those new tools became part of what today we call simply modern technology. Okay. All right. So let's start then with the scientific and technological revolution. This is part one. Okay, so the birth of modern science and technology, likewise, comes into being in the 17 and 1800s, and it is not really at the end of the 1800s when modern science and technology was now firmly established and very well developed, undeniably. Okay, by the late 19th century, from 1865 to 1900, again, we're going to see now most of the new tools of modern technology being innovated there, from electricity to telecommunications, modern transportation systems, and the like. It was now becoming very well developed and very firmly established now, this modern science and technology. And most people were now educated in the new science by the late 19th century. Okay, in schools and colleges and universities, you have to, when you study science, you have to study the new science. Okay, and the schools were also preparing the future generations for this futuristic world, this futuristic high-tech civilization, that is to say. So let's look at the scientific and technological revolution again, how this process unfolded, and why is it significant to understand, why are they called a revolution? Why do we call the advent of this modern science and this modern technology a revolution to begin with? And the reason we call that a revolution is because, as I explained, for example, about capitalism, how capitalism replaced an old economic system that have governed human societies for hundreds and thousands of years called feudalism. Likewise, this modern science and technology, which, by the way, that is the science and technology of today. This was born back in the 17 and 1800s. It also replaced a scientific system that have governed human societies scientifically for hundreds, if not thousands of years as well. So it was a revolution because this science replaced entirely a whole scientific system that people used in the past for millennia to really try to understand the world around them. So that's why it's called a revolution. Okay, it's a complete change in which one scientific model was totally discarded and it was replaced by a new one. Okay, the one that we use today, by the way. Okay, so let's understand first and foremost, what was the old science? Again, understanding the old science, it's important because otherwise we're not going to understand what was so revolutionary about modern science that it has to be understood as revolutionary. Well, the way to do that is by looking at this old science. Okay, the old science. If you understand how people study the world of nature, how people try to understand how the world works, how the world came about, and what make it tick and everything, you'll understand why the new science of the 17 and 1800s was radically different, and so therefore it pretty much, it was almost like it overthrew, how people used to study the universe altogether, because it actually proposed a whole new theory, a whole new model for looking at the universe, in other words. Okay, so the old science, again, that was used back in Europe and literally all over the world. Okay, it was not just uniquely European. This old science was also, something that other societies around the world shared in different forms, but it was a lot of commonalities. Is that in the past, prior to the coming of this modern science, people used religion to understand the world. Okay, it was a religious scientific system. Okay, religious. And by the way, most of the scientists of the past were religious figures. Okay, the astronomers, the chemists, and so on, those were all priests and bishops and so on. Again, the people of the church, they were the scientists conducting experiments, etc. Again, so that tells you how religion and science were one and the same in the past, because the way people understood the world around them is by first, establishing the idea. This is really a universal idea used by literally many groups around the world, many societies, many cultures worldwide before the coming of modern science. And that idea was that, look, people believed, first and foremost, of course, that the world was created by, divine beings. Okay, whether it was one God or a series of gods. Okay, so first and foremost, this is very important. Okay, but furthermore, all over the world, people believed that creation, the world of nature, this world that we live in, of course, the world of matter and natural objects, and, the stars, and everything within it, that those divine beings live in it. In other words, okay. So, in other words, the creators or the creator is not really separate from creation. They're part of the same, uh, uh, you know, uh, complex. Okay, they're part of the same being. In other words, okay, we call this the oneness of the natural and supernatural, meaning like the world of nature and the world of spirits are intertwined. Spirits live in nature, or God is in creation, for example. Okay, people believe that, look, everything that happens in the world of nature can be explained by the spirits that are actually moving, because nature is controlled by spirits. Everything that happens is because there's a ghost or a spirit or a god or a god or a goddess that is making it happen. In other words, okay. So everything, okay, everything that is happening in the world of nature is caused by spirits. It's controlled by spirits, like rain. Why is it rain? Well, because back in Europe, people believe, well, it rains because God brings rain. Or in other places around the world, people believe in, like, the rain god, for example. Okay, so there's the god of rain. That is the one that actually produces the rain. So how do you bring rain? Well, you have to perform a ritual. You have to perform a ceremony for the rain god in order to bring rain. Okay, you call the religious specialist, whether it's a priest or some other figure, the rainmaker, for example, and so on, to do the ritual. Okay, so that's the technology. The technology is ritual. Okay, ritual is the way you control nature, and you don't control it because you want to dominate it. It's just that this is the way you produce rain, for example. Okay, so again, this is something that all cultures and civilizations before the modern age, that starting in the 1700s with modern science and technology, literally all over the world, people have those beliefs again about science, in that when they look at nature, they see nature controlled by different spirits or forces, gods, goddesses, and of course, the belief that there are positive spirits, there's negative spirits, there's angels, there's demons, etc. All of that, of course. But they're the ones that are responsible for what happens in this world. So there's a drought. Okay, so how do you explain a drought? Well, maybe it's because we haven't performed the rituals, or in Europe it was so common to blame witches, for example, for droughts. If people suffered, there's lack of food, crop failures, and so on. People are desperate, say, okay, so why there's a drought? Well, maybe there's a curse. Somebody here in town is cursing us. Let's look for the witch. What is the solution for that problem? Get rid of that witch. That's the solution. It was so common, witch hunts back in Europe, of course. When somebody got sick back in Europe, it was believed, as well as in many places around the world, that sickness often came from the influence of evil spirits as well, entering the body and causing disease. And doctors in Europe, by the way, okay, we're talking about really, people that studied medicine in universities in Paris or in London back in the 15 and 1600s, performed procedures or surgeries to actually expel those evil influences from the blood. It was believed that those evil influences travel in the blood, so it was essential to actually cut, one of those veins to bloodlet. It's called bloodletting, lead blood, in other words, in order to allow for those spirits to be expelled, in order to heal the body of a person, for example. This was actually taught in schools of medicine, by scientists and the like. That was the science, the old science, by the way. Because everything that happens in the world of nature is produced by spirits. So even sickness, for example, it's all the same thing. Why there's an earthquake? Okay, there's an earthquake because back in Europe, it was so common to think that, well, earthquake is the wrath of God. God is angry, who shook the earth because we're sinning or we're not going to church, etc. There's something wrong. We're not behaving appropriately, and so on. So again, so everything that happens in the world of nature is produced by what is called the supernatural. The supernatural is the world of spirits, in other words, because the world of spirits and the world of nature are intertwined. They're part of the same complex. They're one and the same, in other words. There's no distinction. Okay? So you can go case by case by case, and you'll find that every explanation for what happened in the world by scientists was, pinpointed to the world of spirits. For one reason or another, the spirits were responsible. Even human behavior, why people were suffer from seizures, etc. Or mental, for example, problems. Well, because they were possessed, they will say, okay, demonic possession or spirit possession. What is the solution? What is the solution? What is the technology to get that person better? Okay, well, exorcism, a ritual. Send them to a priest. The priest will perform a ritual, and then you get, of course, the spirit to be expelled, and so on. Again, so that was science. But believe it or not, this is not just magic. This is not just folklore or religion. This was actually science back in Europe. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. Okay, so it's not like, okay, so what? That's what's not really science. No, people consider that to be science as well. Okay, so this is the old science that was overthrown by modern science. Of course, modern science is going to come in, the new scientists, and they're going to say, well, let's revise this and propose something completely new or different. And this is how we're going to get a revolution in science and a revolution in technology. So again, this is something that happened starting in the 1700s, even though the father, of course, of modern science was a British scientist, mathematician that lived in the late 1600s and early 1700s, and he pretty much established the principles of a new science. He was the one that gave birth to this new science, what we call today modern science. The word modern simply means new. Okay, the new science, new. Okay. So, what is then, this revolution that this British scientist, I'm about to actually, talk about that in just a second, but this revolution was really the introduction of a new scientific model, that proposed a whole new interpretation of the world and reality. Okay, there was something called a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift is when you replace one version of reality with another. That's a paradigm shift. A paradigm is how you see reality. One version of reality, that's a paradigm. How you actually interpret it, how you see it, was totally replaced by a different one, a new one. That's what a paradigm shift is, okay? And so, in simple terms, this paradigm shift was a version of reality based on religion replaced by a version of reality based on materialism, okay? A materialistic interpretation of reality. So the old science that was based on the notion that there were spirits living in this world and controlling it was totally discarded and replaced by a new one that said, okay, so we don't know if the spirits are real or not, but this new science indicated that the only thing that we can actually see and know and study is matter. And so therefore the new scientists are going to think and say that reality was simply material. Okay? It was materialistic science, by the way. So modern science is very materialistic because it discards really the existence of everything that is non-material. For example, a ghost, okay, is non-material. A spirit is non-material. An angel is non-material. It doesn't mean that they don't exist, but it's not material. So, because people cannot actually measure it and weight it, and they cannot actually grasp it in a lab, etc. So therefore, they simply don't take it into account. So therefore, they only study physical objects. That is to say, something that we can actually, witness, something that we can see, feel, and study and measure it and everything else. Okay, so it's very materialistic. So keeping that in mind, because if you want to understand our science today, it's extremely materialistic. Scientists have to see everything under a microscope or telescope, for that matter. Okay, otherwise they're not even gonna look at it. So they have to see it. Otherwise, it's not something that they're going to be interested in looking at, of course. So it's very much based on the notion that reality is material, this new science, in other words. Okay? And the founder of this new science was the British scientist, mathematician, philosopher, and so on, by the name of Isaac Newton, who was, alive during the late 1600s, early 1700s. And he's the father of modern science, by the way. He's the father of modern science. He introduced a new paradigm, again, a new version of reality, okay, that saw the universe materially, okay? He says, the universe is material, he said. Reality is material, okay? So, by the way, a disclaimer here. The ideas I'm about to present here do not reflect my own. So, I'm about to talk about what Newton said, not what I believe. Okay? So, keep that in mind, because we're going to be talking about so many different ideas across the semester. So, that doesn't mean that I am endorsing or, that I agree necessarily. But when we study the past, we have to study how people think. So that's the craft of the historian. In this case, that's what I do. Okay? There's so many ways of thinking, by the way. Okay? Many ways of looking at reality. And science has one of many. Okay? That doesn't mean that's the only way we can see reality. Science has its own, but that doesn't mean that's the absolute, and only accurate one. Okay? Because science only looks at matter, okay? And so that's exactly what Isaac Newton is proposing, that reality is just material, and that everything that is non-material, he said, cannot be detected, cannot be studied, cannot be measured. So therefore, what he said is, this is something that we cannot know. That does not believe that he did not believe in God. He believed in God, but what he said is that the spiritual world was in a separate level, again, in a separate realm, separate from nature. So he believed that this world, okay, was actually created by God, as a matter of fact. Isaac Newton believed in God, in a creator, but what he believed that when God finished creating the universe, he pretty much left it alone on its own to function mechanically, like a clock, okay, like the clock maker, for example. Okay, so you got the clock maker is making the clock and all the parts and all that. It programs it, and then it just leaves it there, in other words, to function on its own. And it has so many different parts inside, it's very, very, very complex, the mechanism, but it functions pretty much on its own. And God went some other place to pretty much, be in another realm, totally unconcerned. Again, this is his belief. This does not reflect my own, of course, but this is what Newton believed. So he called this the mechanical universe, the mechanical worldview. Okay, that the world is material. That yeah, there's a supernatural world, but there's something somewhere else, the world of spirits, and God is completely detached and removed. And everything that happens here in this world happens because of the laws of nature, the mechanisms. The laws of nature are like the mechanisms, again, that make nature work, that were put there by God, he said, but they were there, to work mechanically. Okay? So this is, again, a new paradigm, a new version of reality that Newton introduces, of course, in the late 1600s and early 1700s, when most people were still, at that time, studying the world through religion. Okay? And so let me just explain, step by step here. We don't have much time. We probably have just, let me see. Yeah, perhaps even just 5 minutes, but it's going to be enough. So at this juncture, let me just explain, the central ideas of this new science that Newton is bringing about. Okay, I just mentioned one, and that is the idea that reality is material. Okay, this is what Newton proposes. Okay, is the idea of science centered on the the notion that reality is material is called secularism. Secularism, again, this is something that modern science introduced, okay, in Europe and then later in the United States. The idea of secularism is that, look, the world that we live in, the here and the now, okay, this material world is totally separate from the spiritual. The spiritual is in some other realm, completely independent and separate, and there's no connection between the spiritual and the material. Again, this is what Newton was saying. In other words, this material world operates under natural laws and it's on its own, pretty much. Okay? So, again, the idea of secularism, again, is that reality is material, and that the only thing that we can actually know and discover is matter. In other words, because we have five senses that tells us what matter is. We can see it, we can smell it, we can taste it, we can feel it, we can hear it. And so therefore, this is the world that we can know. In other words, we can measure it, we can understand it, and so on and so forth. Again, the here and the now. Okay, so the here and the now means that this world right here that we live in, this physical reality, this physical existence, this physical planet that we live in is real and is important, and we should take care of it. In other words, we should strive to understand it better, and furthermore, that we should strive to understand how it works. What are the laws of nature? It's a mystery. The laws of nature, how God created the world and created the mechanisms, of this gigantic clock, that this whole universe is like a clock, that what scientists are supposed to do is actually discover the laws. That's what science is supposed to do. Discover the laws of nature. Go out there in the field and observe why there's rain, for example. Okay? And so on. So again, this is the idea of secularism, again, that we should be concerned with this material world because they said matter is real. Okay? And we should study it. We should measure it. We should understand how it works. The laws of nature. This is the role of the scientist. The role of the scientist is to discover how God programmed, in other words, this world, this gigantic clock. And how to do that, that's the second idea, again, of this modern science, is that there's a method. There's a method for knowing and exploring the world of matter. If we are to discover the laws of nature, there's a method. We call it the scientific method. Okay? The scientific method proposed by Newton is called empiricism or positivism. Okay, so what is it? Okay, so what Newton is saying is that the method to gather knowledge is through the five senses. In other words, that you have to experience it in the material world. to be real. If you are going to discover any of the laws of nature, you have to be able to see it, in other words. Not just say, well, last night I had this dream and suddenly I understand why there's rain. Okay? Okay. For this new science, that's not enough. Or that you have this vision, or etc. That you have to witness, you have to experiment, you have to actually gather facts, material facts. You have to experience something in order to be real. So you can say, I went outside and I observed in the material world with my senses, the process of rain. I witnessed the evaporation of water from the ground. It was intense heat in a hot summer. And I witnessed that this water, this body of water, was totally evaporated. It became gas. And so this gas was transported into the atmosphere. And I saw cloud formation. So the clouds that we see in the sky is just is gas, is vapor, is water that has been evaporated. And when those clouds become so filled with water, with being condensed, they burst and they precipitate, and you have this process of rain. This is something that other people can witness. Not by imagining it, but you can actually go outside and actually take notes and see that this is the mechanism of rain. This is the law of rain. This is mechanical. It's mechanical, in other words. So likewise, you can study anything, anything that you want to know how it works, why there's an earthquake, why there's a volcano, you just have to go there in the field and do material observations, in other words, and gather facts in order to understand the world of nature. That is the scientific method. It's called empiricism, knowledge gathered from experience, or positivism, in which you have positive, in other words, confirmation that something is real or fact, material fact. You're positive. When you say I'm positive, that means that you have, of course, direct, knowledge. You have facts to say I am positive about this statement. That you have gathered facts, in other words. So that's a method, and that's the method that all scientists are using today to do research for anything. People have to actually engage in experience, with the five senses, seeing something, to be real, and documenting in order to say this is how it works. Mechanically, everything is really, modern science is everything really mechanical, of course. Okay. So we have arrived, of course, to the end of our first session. The only thing, again, is pretty much the afternote here before we go into the technology part in session 2 is, by the 1800s, of course, this science was becoming so much established in Europe, in France, in Germany, England, Holland, the United States. And many people really believe that finally human beings have arrived to a scientific method to understand how the world works, that they said this is now, again, the new revelation of truth. In other words, the new proponents of this new science believe that this is finally a real science as opposed to the science of the past, they said. Because they said, well, what they said is that this science was based on facts, in other words, material facts. And what people actually did in the past was simply assume, things to be real or happening. So much so that in 1842, there was a French philosopher by the name of Auguste Comte who wrote, again, a book called The Positivist Philosophy, in which he was just praising, this new science, people are now calling it modern science by this time, or the positivist, they said, science based on facts, because the promise, according to Auguste Comte, again, of this new science was that finally, for the first time in a long time since the emergence of humans on Earth, that humans finally got it, he said. Look, this is him talking, not me. That finally, again, human beings finally got it. They arrived to a scientific model for understanding the world of nature that was going to allow humans to master and control nature. That is the ultimate promise of science. It's not just to be knowledgeable and know the laws of nature. Is that what are you going to do with that knowledge? Okay, what does science promise? In the end, is that yeah, you got all this knowledge, but so what? What are you going to do with it? What Auguste Comte is saying is that the promise is that this knowledge is going to empower human beings to master and control nature. So instead of being victims of nature and suffer from all the calamities and the catastrophes of the past, that we were so helpless in the face of nature. We were experiencing famine and epidemics and everything else, very, very helpless. That no, with this new knowledge that finally we were going to subdue and dominate nature and overcome all of that. Solve the problems of crop production. We can produce large quantities of products. Feed more people, extend the lifespan of individuals to live longer. Perhaps even stop aging. Why not? To control the weather. Make rain and whatever. Again, humans in control. In other words, okay. That is the promise. Many people had that faith. So much so that people place more faith in this new science than in religion. They said, well, so instead of going to church and going to a priest to solve a problem, why don't we just go to a scientist, to solve the problem? So science was now becoming the new religion. In other words, it was replacing God. In other words, and for many people, not for all people, but a lot of people saw that instead of appealing to the divine for solutions whenever people had a problem, is that all you need to do is appeal to a scientist, okay? And the scientist was going to solve that problem. In other words, okay, science is now the new religion. In other words, for the peoples, of course, that endorse this new science. Okay, so that's all I have for you. And when we come back in session 2, we're going to look into the technological revolution. Okay, new technologies and such. And then, once we move past that, we move into the theory of evolution. So this is all I have for you for this session. And I'll see you then in session 2 for the remaining portion of this lecture. Thank you.